On a crystalline spring morning in April 1943, the skies above occupied France bore witness to a moment that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the entire air war over Europe. The date was April 8, and at 27,000 feet above the countryside near Caen, France, a formation of German fighters owned the upper atmosphere. These were experienced pilots, veterans of Poland, France, Britain, and the frozen steppes of Russia. They had seen combat continuously since 1939, and they carried the confidence of warriors who had tasted victory in nearly every arena where they had flown. Among them was Oberleutnant Ralph Hermican, a seasoned ace from Jägerschwader 26, nicknamed the Ace of Ypres. The 26-year-old pilot sat comfortably in his Focke-Wulf 190A5, an aircraft that represented the cutting edge of German fighter design. Below him, climbing laboriously through the transparent spring air, came a formation of American fighters attempting to join a bomber stream. As Hermican watched them through his crystal-clear canopy, something stirred in him that he hadn't felt since the early days of the war: amusement, pure and unmistakable. He reached for his radio and transmitted words that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. "The Americans have sent us flying milk bottles." His wingman laughed. The other pilots in the formation grinned. These German aviators, hardened by years of combat, looked down at the approaching machines with something approaching contempt. There, climbing toward them with visible effort, were 16 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group. They looked nothing like fighters. Their massive, barrel-shaped fuselages seemed grotesquely fat. The aircraft were topped with bubble canopies that made them resemble peculiar insects more than deadly weapons. Their engines were enormous Pratt & Whitney Air 2800 double wasp radials that gave them a bloated, almost pregnant appearance, particularly around the engine nacelle. To pilots accustomed to the sleek, elegant lines of German aircraft, these American machines appeared almost comical. The wings seemed disproportionately small for such corpulent bodies. The propellers were massive, dwarfing anything in the Luftwaffe's inventory. Captain Werner Schroer, another experienced fighter pilot, radioed his observation. "The Americans are flying barrels." The description became legendary, repeated in mess halls and debriefing rooms across occupied France. The pilots weren't being cruel, exactly. They were simply reporting what their eyes told them. These American aircraft represented a fundamental misunderstanding of how air combat should be conducted. German fighter doctrine emphasized agility, climb rate, and the ability to maneuver in tight turning fights. These machines were the opposite of agile. They were, to any observer with professional military experience, clearly inferior in almost every respect that mattered in 1943 air warfare. What these German pilots couldn't have known, what no amount of professional experience or tactical brilliance could have revealed to them in that moment, was that they were witnesses to the arrival of the weapon system that would systematically, methodically, and eventually completely destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Within 18 months, these flying milk bottles would transform from objects of derision into instruments of terror so effective that German pilots would experience nightmares at the mere sound of their engines. That distinctive, thundering roar created by propeller blade tips reaching supersonic speeds became known as Donnerschlag thunderclap. German troops began reporting that they could identify approaching thunderbolts by sound alone, from miles away, long before the aircraft appeared on the horizon. The mathematical reality of destruction was already loaded into those broad wings. 3,400 rounds of ammunition, divided among 8 Browning machine guns, created a combined rate of fire of 6,000 rounds per minute. That represented enough concentrated firepower to saw a fighter aircraft in half in less than 2 seconds. At 100 yards, a 2-second burst from all 8 guns would place approximately 200 projectiles into a target area the size of a truck. Each round traveled at 2,900 feet per second, and the ammunition mixture included armor-piercing incendiary rounds burning at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite aluminum structure instantly. But on that April morning, these statistics meant nothing to the German pilots. They saw only an ungainly, heavy aircraft that climbed poorly, turned worse, and apparently had no business being in the sky at all. Their laughter would echo through the archives of history, preserved in combat reports and interrogation records, a testimony to overconfidence about to be shattered by the relentless logic of industrial warfare and superior design philosophy. The transformation began that very morning when Major Donald Blakesley, commanding the 335th Fighter Squadron and a former Eagle Squadron veteran who had just transitioned from RAF Spitfires to the P-47, spotted the German formation positioning for attack. Blakesley understood something his men didn't yet know, something that would take months of bloody combat to demonstrate. Survival in the P-47 required abandoning everything conventional wisdom had taught about air combat. The Thunderbolt represented not an evolution of fighter design philosophy, but a radical departure from it, an entirely different approach based on American industrial capability, mass production, and a strategic vision of aerial warfare that European pilots had never contemplated. Section 2. The genesis. Alexander Kartvel's vision. To understand how the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt came to exist, you must first understand the man who created it. Alexander Kartveli was born in Tbilisi, Georgia, in 1896, during the twilight of the Russian Empire. He was a trained aeronautical engineer who had studied in Paris at the highest institutions of aeronautical learning. Like many brilliant engineers of his era, he found his way to America seeking opportunity and the freedom to pursue his ambitions. By the 1930s, he had become the chief designer for what would eventually become Republic Aviation Corporation. In June of 1940, as German fighters were sweeping across France and the Low Countries with devastating efficiency, the United States Army Air Corps became genuinely concerned about its ability to defend against the Luftwaffe. American military leadership had observed German air combat operations closely, and the implications were clear. American fighters of 1940 were not competitive with German types. The Army issued urgent specifications for a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching Germany's best fighters. The requirement was straightforward: an aircraft that could climb quickly, reach high altitudes where performance remained strong, and possess sufficient firepower to deal with enemy fighters. It was during this climate of urgency and concern that Kartveli received his marching orders. What happened next was entirely unexpected. Rather than designing a lightweight interceptor optimized for climb and maneuverability, the conventional approach that had dominated fighter design since the beginning of aviation, Kartveli chose to move in precisely the opposite direction. He began sketching designs for an aircraft of unprecedented size and weight. He designed it around the most powerful radial engine available: the Pratt & Whitney Air 2800 Double Wasp, a massive 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower. Then came the complication. This enormous engine required an equally enormous turbo-supercharger system to maintain power at high altitude. The turbo-supercharger was fed by exhaust gases from the engine itself, a complex system that involved elaborate ducting running through the rear fuselage. This ducting, and the entire supercharger installation, took up enormous space, more space than most aircraft designers had ever tried to accommodate in a fighter. The result was an aircraft that made no sense on paper. It was overweight. It was underpowered relative to its mass. It violated every principle of fighter design that had dominated aeronautical engineering since the first Spads and Sopwith Camels had flown during the Great War. Kartveli knew exactly what he was creating. In a moment of characteristic candor, he confessed to his design team, "It will be a dinosaur." He paused, then added, "But it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." This phrase, more than any technical specification, captured his vision. He wasn't trying to build a conventional fighter. He was creating something entirely new, an aircraft designed around American industrial philosophy: mass, power, durability, and firepower. While German designers pursued lightweight interceptors optimized for climb and turn performance, Kartveli was designing a high-altitude juggernaut that would use raw mass and power to redefine the rules of aerial warfare. The prototype, designated XP-47B, first flew on May 6, 1941. Test pilots and engineers who approached it for the first time invariably asked the same question: "This thing actually flies?" It weighed 9,900 pounds empty, 65% more than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. The massive turbo-supercharger system gave it an almost pregnant appearance, with its distinctive bulging rear fuselage and complex ducting. Nothing about it looked right to observers trained in conventional fighter design. But once it was airborne, the performance told a completely different story. The Pratt & Whitney Air 2800 Double Wasp engine could maintain full power at 27,000 feet where German fighters gasped for air. The turbo-supercharger delivered sea-level performance in the stratosphere where the air was too thin for conventional superchargers to function effectively. Climb rate was adequate rather than spectacular. Maneuverability was sluggish. But high-altitude performance was extraordinary. At 30,000 feet and above, the P-47 operated in a realm where German fighters struggled. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, with its water-cooled Daimler-Benz engine, suffered significantly at extreme altitudes. The Focke-Wulf 190, with its BMW 801 air-cooled engine, was more effective at altitude than the 109, but it still couldn't match the Thunderbolt's power curve above 25,000 feet. The aircraft seemed destined for success. Production orders were placed almost immediately. Major Hubert Hub Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group at Bridgeport, Connecticut, was assigned this new fighter and tasked with training pilots on it. What followed was not triumph, but tragedy. Between September 1942 and January 1943, the 56th Fighter Group lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents. The P-47 proved to be a demanding, unforgiving machine in the hands of pilots learning its characteristics. It ground-looped on landing, the nose gear would catch and the aircraft would flip upside down. It torque-rolled on takeoff, the massive torque from the powerful engine overwhelming the aircraft's yaw control authority. It dove with such enthusiasm that pilots experienced compressibility shock waves formed on the wings, and the control surfaces became locked, frozen solid. Pilots who survived these early encounters often did so only because they managed to regain altitude where the air was thinner and the shock waves dissipated. The aircraft, in short, was dangerous. Zemke initially despised it, but he also possessed the professional competence to recognize something important. Pilots who mastered this aircraft, who learned to work with rather than against its characteristics, had acquired a machine with extraordinary capabilities. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who would eventually become one of America's greatest aces with 27 confirmed victories, described his first flight in a P-47 with memorable clarity. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it, you aimed it. This single phrase captured the essential nature of the aircraft. The P-47 was powerful enough, with sufficient weight and engine power, that trying to be subtle with it was futile. You climbed to altitude, aimed at your target, applied power, and let the physics of mass and motion do the work for you. Section 3. First encounters, the laughter period. By April 1943, enough P-47s had arrived in England that the 8th Air Force felt confident enough to commit them to combat. The 56th Fighter Group, still struggling with training losses but finally achieving some degree of operational competence, was authorized to begin flying combat missions. The initial encounters confirmed every German prejudice about the aircraft. The P-47s couldn't turn with the Focke-Wulf 190s. They couldn't climb with the Messerschmitt 109s. At the medium altitudes where most of the air combat was actually taking place, around 15,000 to 20,000 feet, they couldn't match the maneuverability and climb rate of German fighters. Luftwaffe pilots quickly developed tactics to exploit these weaknesses. They would attack from below, where the heavy Thunderbolt struggled to maneuver effectively. They would force turning fights, understanding that in a dogfight where agility and rate of turn mattered more than anything else, their aircraft had significant advantages. Oberleutnant Joseph Sepp Priller, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 26, reported to headquarters after his first combat encounter with the new American fighter. The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. Our boys are calling them India's fat targets, pretending to be warriors. The statistics of early 1943 seemed to validate German confidence completely. In their first month of operations, American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts for only 3 confirmed German kills. The loss ratio was devastating. The RAF, observing from their Spitfire squadrons, quietly suggested to their American allies that they might want to reconsider their choice of aircraft. British pilots joked privately that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap from the seat and run around the roomier cockpit. For those who didn't understand the deeper truths about air combat, the data appeared conclusive. The P-47 was inferior. It was slower in climb than German fighters. It was less maneuverable. It couldn't turn as tightly. In every category where pilots judged fighters through the lens of conventional air combat experience, the Thunderbolt appeared to be clearly outclassed. American pilots were paying with their lives to learn a simple truth. When you flew an aircraft that wasn't designed for conventional air combat, trying to engage in conventional air combat was suicide. Yet something was happening in those early encounters that German intelligence failed to notice. It would take months for the significance of these observations to become apparent, but they were hiding in plain sight. The P-47s that were shot down had absorbed incredible punishment before falling. One aircraft returned from a May 4 mission with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes damage that would have utterly destroyed a Messerschmitt or a Spitfire, reducing either of those aircraft to smoking debris. But the massive radial engine of the Thunderbolt, lacking vulnerable coolant systems, shrugged off hits that would have stopped a liquid-cooled fighter cold. More significantly, when P-47s did get their guns on target, the results were catastrophic in a way that German pilots had never experienced. The Thunderbolt's weapons battery created a convergence zone of destruction that defied everything pilots knew about aerial gunnery. Unlike the rifle-caliber weapons of early war fighters, or the limited ammunition cannons of contemporary German fighters, the American aircraft could maintain sustained fire for over 30 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat, where most engagements lasted only a handful of seconds. The 8 Browning machine guns could be fired continuously, placing hundreds of rounds per second into a target area. German pilots who had fought against Spitfires and Hurricanes throughout the Battle of Britain and the subsequent years of combat had never experienced this volume of fire. They had flown against aircraft with machine guns and light cannon, true, but nothing quite like the sustained, concentrated firepower of 8.50 caliber Brownings all converging on a single target. When a P-47 got its guns on a target, the result wasn't a damaged aircraft that could limp home. The result was obliteration. Aircraft caught in the convergence zone of a Thunderbolt's firepower didn't fall gracefully to earth. They disintegrated. But these lessons lay in the future. In the spring and early summer of 1943, the dominant narrative was German superiority and American futility. The laughter in German mess halls continued, reinforced by increasingly one-sided kill ratios. The P-47, to experienced Luftwaffe pilots, represented everything wrong with American military aircraft, design an enormous, heavy machine that violated every principle of air combat they had learned through years of actual combat experience. Section 4. Learning the hard way, the cost of education. The early losses of the 56th Fighter Group were grievous. Young pilots, many of them fresh from training with relatively few hours of flight time, were being matched against German pilots with hundreds of combat missions. Some of the 56th's pilots had fewer than 40 hours of total flight time when they entered combat. They were facing Luftwaffe veterans with multiple years of combat experience. The disparity in experience was staggering. Major Hubert Zemke watched his pilots get shot down with increasing frustration. More than frustration, actually something approaching despair. The P-47 wasn't matching the performance of German fighters in the way that American military leadership had hoped. The bomber streams were still being intercepted. American pilots were still dying at a dispiriting rate. By midsummer 1943, it appeared possible that the P-47, despite its impressive technical specifications, would simply not be competitive in the European air war. The problem, as Zemke eventually came to understand through brutal trial and error, was not with the aircraft itself. The problem was with how the aircraft was being employed. American pilots were trying to fight German fighters in the manner they had been taught in turning fights where maneuverability and climb rate were paramount. They were trying to turn with Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts, trying to outmaneuver aircraft that were specifically designed for maneuverability. This was precisely the wrong approach. In June 1943, something shifted. The 56th Fighter Group finally achieved what had eluded them for months. Their first confirmed air-to-air victories. It wasn't because the P-47 had suddenly improved. It was because the pilots, under Zemke's increasingly insistent coaching, had begun to understand the fundamental principle that would transform the Thunderbolt from a liability into an asset. Zemke's teaching was blunt and direct. Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them at low altitude. Don't engage them on their terms. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns. This wasn't conventional fighter doctrine. This was something entirely new, a tactical philosophy built around the specify.